welcome to the Basket Wildlife Research and Education Center. My name is Lauren Pyle. I'm a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station in Columbia, Missouri. I'm located on the University of Missouri campus. I'm here today to talk to you about invasive species, and primarily invasive plants. If we look around us, we see a sea of green, and we would think that this is good. However, most of the species that you see surrounding me are invasive plants. We're going to talk a little bit about why they're important to know, how to identify them, and some key attributes to their ecology. The problem with invasive plants is that they outcompete our native plants, resulting in very few species on the landscape, decreasing our biodiversity, and having trophic interactions with all of our other species, including birds, amphibians, and mammals. Even standing right here, I have a diverse array of invasive species. First one we see is autumn olive. This is an invasive species, both in prairies and old fields, including in forest interiors. So it's somewhat shade tolerant, and it's able to invade a wider range of habitats. It also sort of dampens fire when fire goes through it. So with prescribed fire, we're not able to control this species very well. A little bit higher up here, we have bush honeysuckle. Bush honeysuckle, there's quite a few different species in this region, and it's also shade tolerant, which means it can invade our interior forests as well. As we move back here, we have Callery pear, also called Bradford pear. This species was introduced as a cultivar and is primarily planted in a lot of our suburbs. However, as they increased the number of cultivars, it was originally sterile, and now it's been able to reproduce and spread. And so now you see it spreading into roadsides and also cleared land. We also have Sericea lespedeza. This one invades roadsides and also pastures and prairies. It's highly invasive and it's really difficult to control. We have native lespedezas that look very similar. And we'll tell you a little bit more about how to identify the difference later. And then we have Lespedeza bicolor. A very pretty species, but again, it's an invasive species that can really outcompete our native species. So as we take a few steps over from our last spot, we see Multiflora rose. This species was planted extensively by a lot of our public agencies for wildlife habitat. However, it's now become quite invasive in our forest understories, and it has thorns, so it makes it really difficult to get through our forests. So it can really impede things like recreation. And we also have several species of native roses. Most of those have pink flowers, whereas when this blooms, it has white flowers. And as we move up, we have this invasive vine, Asian bittersweet. We also have a native bittersweet that's called American bittersweet. But this particular Asian bittersweet is very prolific on the Basket Wildlife Research and Education Center, and it really chokes out our native trees. So as you see, it's climbing up into the tree, and it can basically cover the entire canopy of the tree and make it really difficult for the leaves to get enough sunlight of our native species to help them survive. So we want to really make sure that we're controlling the species. And like I said, it is actually one of our most abundant species on Basket. So let's talk about a few identifying features of the species I just talked about. So this is autumn olive. One of the best ways to identify autumn olive, it's a shrub. It has a green upper surface and a very silvery backside. And that's one of the best ways to identify it. We don't have any real species that are like that in Missouri. Our next species is bush honeysuckle. Bush honeysuckle has opposite leaves, and what that means is the leaves come off from the stem across from each other. It also has leaves that have pointy tips, and that's called acuminate. The berries are produced in the axils of the leaves, and they turn red in the fall, so these are just starting to ripen. However, we have a species that's very similar in its leaf arrangement and the way it looks. Bush honeysuckle can get very tall, so it can get to about 15 feet, and it's a pretty tall bush. Our native species here is coralberry. Coralberry typically doesn't get taller than about 3 or 4 feet. It can be pretty clonal, so it can produce a lot of stems on the ground. One of the best ways to identify coralberry from our bush honeysuckle is we don't really have that pointy tip. It's a bit more blunted than, say, our bush honeysuckle. And then also that smaller stature really helps. We get clusters of berries in the axils, and based on the name, these berries as they ripen will turn coral in color. Also, our bush honeysuckle has a hollow pith, so if you were to cut it open, you would actually notice that it has a hollow center to it. Sericea lespedeza, one of the species that's very problematic in prairies and roadsides and pastures, has a turkey foot shaped leaf, so it has 3 little leaflets forming a bit of a turkey foot. The best way to identify this from our native species is actually the leaf venation. So I'm standing here roadside on the Basket Wildlife Research Center to talk to you about one more species that we have out here. It's currently in low abundance, but throughout eastern North America, it's actually a very dominant invasive species. And the species I'm talking about is Tree of Heaven, or Ailanthus, and it's right here behind me. Tree of Heaven is, for you bibliophiles out there, is also the species that's referred to in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And so this species on the front cover is actually growing out of a sidewalk, and it sort of points to the characteristics of this tree where it can grow pretty much anywhere. And so I just want to talk about a little bit of how you identify the species versus our black walnut. And so the two species can look very similar, and I'll show you some characteristics of the leaves that help you point out the differences. So in my right hand here, I have black walnut. In my left hand, I have Tree of Heaven. You can see that each one of these species has a lot of leaflets. So this is an entire leaf, and all of those single leaves are called leaflets. So you can see that it has a terminal bud, very pointy and stout terminal bud. Whereas on our Tree of Heaven, we actually have what looks like a lacking terminal bud. So it's very flattened. Another key characteristic is that the Tree of Heaven has a glandular leaflet. So if we look at the end of the leaf towards the base, it has that pointy little gland there. Now on our native black walnuts, we have no glands. So that's another key characteristic. Often our black walnuts also lack a terminal leaflet, and so you can see where it ends in 2 leaves, whereas on our Tree of Heaven, we have a terminal leaflet, and again, it has that gland toward the leaf base. So that's another key characteristic. Another interesting characteristic is that our black walnut has a brown pith. The pith on our black walnut is also chambered, and so if you were to slice it lengthwise with a knife, you'd actually see a chambered dark pith. Versus our Tree of Heaven has a peanut butter colored pith. It also kind of smells. People call it stink tree. It smells a bit like rotten peanut butter, so that's another key characteristic. And those are some of the key characteristics between our native black walnut and our highly invasive Tree of Heaven or stink tree. The Basket Wildlife Research Education Center serves as a great living laboratory for invasive species research. The former agricultural land practices that turned into today's forests help serve as an example for the way our forests look around mid-Missouri. As we stand here, we have a great research project looking at the sprouting potential of invasive species and how our native species respond to management of those invasive species. We have autumn olive, bush honeysuckle, multiflora rose, and Asian bittersweet, all within this very plot. We also have quite a few native species, including a lot of diverse oaks. So as we look across the plot, we have both orange and pink flags. The orange flags represent our invasive species, whereas the pink flag represent our native species. You can see from the plot that there's actually quite a few orange flags. That represents the abundance of invasive species on the Basket Wildlife Research Center. We're going to see how these species respond to treatment through time, and if invasive species management helps promote our native species, particularly our oaks.